The entire town watched as flames devoured Red Hollow, but nobody moved to help the Chinese woman trapped inside the burning saloon. Nobody except the scarred cowboy they all thought had lost his mind. What happened next would shatter everything this Texas town believed about outsiders, survival, and the kind of courage that hides beneath layers of dirt and shame. This is a story about a woman the frontier tried to break, and the unexpected friendship that refused to let her disappear. Stay until the end, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The wind cut through Red Hollow like a dull blade. Slow, deliberate, cruel. It was the kind of wind that didn't just chill you. It reminded you that West Texas didn't care whether you lived or died. And 1879 wasn't offering any exceptions. Maylin stood at the edge of the town square, her back pressed against the rough planks of Henderson's general store. The wood was warm from the afternoon sun, but she couldn't feel it. She'd stopped feeling much of anything 3 towns ago. Her traveling clothes, if you could still call them that, hung off her frame like something dug out of a grave. Dust had worked its way into every fiber, every crease, until the original color was just a memory. Her hair, black as midnight and twice as tangled, fell across her face in matted strands that she didn't bother pushing away anymore. She'd learned that looking down, looking broken, sometimes kept the worst of it at bay. There she is again. The voice came from somewhere to her left. Mrs. Patricia Caldwell, the banker's wife, speaking just loud enough to be heard, but not so loud she could be called out for cruelty. Poor thing looks like something the dogs wouldn't even drag home. Laughter rippled through the small crowd of women gathered near the post office steps. Sharp, bright laughter that had nothing to do with joy. Maylene's fingers tightened around the rough cloth sack she carried, everything she owned in the world. A spare shirt with holes in the elbows, a tin cup, a knife she'd traded for 2 weeks ago from a half-drunk prospector who'd probably forgotten the transaction by morning. I heard she came from the railroad camps up north, another voice chimed in. Sarah Miller, the schoolteacher's daughter, barely 17 and already perfecting the art of casual viciousness. My daddy says those people bring disease, says they don't wash proper. Maylin had heard worse. In Sacramento, men had thrown stones. In a nameless settlement outside Austin, someone had set fire to the tiny shed where she'd been sleeping. She'd escaped with her life and not much else. The trick was not to react. The trick was to become so still, so invisible, that eventually they'd lose interest and move on to easier prey. Ma says we should run her out before she brings us bad luck, a boy's voice piped up. Tommy Brennan, maybe 10 years old, already learning that cruelty was currency in a town this small. Ma says Chinese people got strange magic that makes crops fail. Maylin wanted to laugh at that. Magic. If she had any magic, she'd have used it long ago to disappear completely. The sun was starting its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if she'd had the energy to care. She needed to find somewhere to sleep tonight, somewhere out of sight. The last time she'd tried sleeping near the main road, someone had kicked her awake at dawn and told her to move along before decent people had to look at her. She started walking, keeping her eyes on the dusty ground, trying to make herself smaller with every step. That's when she heard the horse. The sound of hooves on packed earth wasn't unusual in Red Hollow, but something about the rhythm of this particular horse made her look up despite herself. Maybe it was the steady, unhurried pace. Maybe it was the way the other sounds in the street seemed to quiet down, as if the whole town was holding its breath. The rider was tall, impossibly tall from her vantage point, and sat his horse like someone who'd been born in the saddle. His hat was pulled low, shadowing most of his face, but she could see the hard line of his jaw and a scar that ran from his left temple down to his chin. Not a neat scar, a fighting scar. Elias Boone had the look of a man who'd seen things that would make most people flinch, and who'd stopped flinching a long time ago. He dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots hitting the ground with a solid thud that seemed louder than it should have been. For a moment he just stood there, one hand still on the saddle, looking at nothing in particular. Then his eyes found her. Maylin's first instinct was to run. Strange men noticing her had never led anywhere good, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. She was too tired, too hungry, too worn down by weeks of running to run anymore. Elias didn't move closer right away. He just looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not disgust, not pity either. Something else. something that made her chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "You need help, ma'am?" His voice was rougher than she expected, like gravel rolling around in a tin cup. The question was so unexpected that for a second she forgot how to speak English. The words tangled up in her throat with the Cantonese she'd grown up speaking, and the broken phrases she'd picked up working in railroad camps where nobody cared about grammar as long as you understood which end of the hammer to use. She stopped, started again. "I'm filthy. Don't touch me." The words came out harsher than she meant them to, but they were true. She hadn't had a proper bath in weeks. Her clothes smelled like wood smoke and sweat and desperation. Her hair was a matted mess that probably had things living in it. Behind Elias, she could see people gathering, watching, waiting for the show. "The Cowboy's lost his mind," someone muttered. "Probably drunk," someone else offered. But Elias didn't seem to notice or care about the audience. He reached for something on his saddle. Maylin tensed and pulled out a canteen. Simple, battered. The kind of thing every traveler carried. He took 2 steps forward and set it on the ground between them. Not close enough to crowd her. Not far enough to make her feel dismissed. "Dust washes off," he said quietly. "Been covered in plenty of it myself, but cruelty?" He glanced back at the crowd with those hard, measuring eyes. That stuff gets into people and poisons them from the inside out. Stays with them forever. Maylin stared at the canteen like it might explode. Nobody had offered her water in 3 towns. Nobody had offered her anything except insults and threats and the occasional rock thrown hard enough to bruise. Her voice cracked. "I don't have money to pay you. Didn't ask for money. Then what do you want?" The question came out sharp, defensive, because in her experience, everyone wanted something. Kindness always had a price tag, and she'd learned that the hard way more times than she could count. Elias tilted his head slightly, considering, "For you to drink some water, you look about 3 days past thirsty." He wasn't wrong. Her lips were cracked. Her throat felt like she'd been swallowing sand. But accepting help, accepting anything, felt dangerous. It felt like opening a door she'd spent months learning to keep locked. The crowd was getting restless. She could feel their eyes on her back, their judgment pressing down like a physical weight. "Take it or leave it, ma'am," Elias said, and there was no pressure in his voice, just a statement of fact. "But if you're still here at sundown, you should know the temperature drops fast this time of year. Gets cold enough to hurt." He turned and started walking toward the saloon, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. Just like that. No expectation. No demand for gratitude. Maylin waited until he'd disappeared through the saloon doors before she moved. Then with shaking hands, she picked up the canteen and took the smallest sip she could manage. The water was warm and tasted faintly metallic, but it was the best thing she'd experienced in weeks. The next morning started with violence. Maylin had spent the night wedged between 2 buildings on the east side of town, her body curled into the smallest shape possible to conserve warmth. Sleep came in fragments, broken by the sound of every footstep, every distant voice, every reminder that she wasn't safe and probably never would be again. She woke to someone kicking the sole of her boot. "Get up, you yellow rat." The voice belonged to Frank Morrison, one of the ranch hands from the Double M spread. She'd seen him around town, always loud, always looking for someone to push around. He smelled like whiskey, even at dawn. Maylin scrambled backward, her back hitting the wall, her hands instinctively coming up to protect her face. "I said get up." Frank kicked again, harder this time, his boot connecting with her shin hard enough to make her gasp. "You can't just sleep anywhere you want. This ain't China." "I'm leaving," she managed to say, hating how small her voice sounded. "I'm leaving right now." "Damn right you are." Frank grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise, and yanked her to her feet. "Maybe I should help you along, give you a head start out of town." His friends laughed, 3 of them, all cut from the same cloth. Men who'd been told their whole lives that they mattered more than people who looked like her, and who'd never questioned it. "Let her go, Frank." The voice came from behind them, calm, flat, absolutely devoid of anything resembling fear. Elias stood at the mouth of the alley, his hand resting casually on his belt, nowhere near the gun at his hip, but close enough to make a point. Frank's grip loosened slightly. "This ain't your business, Boone." "Making it my business." "She's just some railroad trash that wandered in from, Let her go. Elias said it the same way he might comment on the weather. No heat, no anger, just a simple statement of what was going to happen next. For a long moment, nobody moved. Maylin could feel her pulse hammering in her throat, could feel Frank's fingers still wrapped around her arm like a vice. Then Frank shoved her away hard enough that she stumbled, catching herself against the wall. You got a thing for Chinese whores, Boone? Frank sneered. That what this is about? Elias didn't rise to the bait. He just stood there, waiting, until Frank and his friends finally retreated, throwing insults over their shoulders like they'd won something. When they were gone, Maylin tried to steady her breathing, tried to stop her hands from shaking. You hurt? Elias asked. She shook her head. It was a lie. Her shin throbbed and her arm already had finger-shaped bruises forming, but the truth felt too complicated. Why do you keep helping me? The question burst out before she could stop it. Nobody helps me. Not for free. Elias was quiet for a moment, his eyes scanning the empty alley like he was looking for an answer written on the walls. Had a sister once, he finally said. Long time ago. She got caught on the wrong side of a flood during a wagon crossing. Whole party just stood there watching her get swept away because they were too scared to jump in, too worried about their own skins. He paused, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he didn't want to say. I was 12, couldn't swim worth a damn. But I jumped in anyway because she was my sister and nobody else was going to do it. Managed to grab her and get us both to a sandbar downriver. That's... Maylin didn't know how to finish the sentence. Point is, Elias continued, whole camp acted like I was some kind of hero after. But all I could think about was how every single adult stood there doing nothing. How easy it was for them to decide one person wasn't worth the risk. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something in his expression made her chest ache. Swore that day I'd never be the person who just stands there watching. Figure the world's got enough of those already. Maylin wanted to say something profound, something that would match the weight of what he'd just shared, but all that came out was, your sister. Did she make it? Died 2 years later. Cholera. Elias's voice didn't change, but something flickered across his face too fast for her to catch. Turns out you can survive a flood and still lose to something you can't see coming. They stood in uncomfortable silence for a moment. You got somewhere safe to stay? Elias asked. Maylin almost laughed. Safe. The word felt foreign. I make do. That's not what I asked. No, she admitted. No, I don't. Elias nodded like he'd expected that answer. There's a boarding house on Maple Street. Mrs. Chen runs it. She's from Guangzhou originally. Might be more inclined to rent you a room than some of the other places. I told you, I don't have money. Didn't say you needed money right this second. Said she might be more inclined. He pulled a small coin purse from his pocket and held it out. Consider it a loan. Pay me back when you can. Maylin stared at the purse like it was a snake. Why are you doing this? Because nobody else is. It was such a simple answer, such a devastating answer. She took the purse with numb fingers. Mrs. Chen's boarding house was a narrow, 2-story building that leaned slightly to the left, like it was tired of standing up straight. The paint was peeling, the porch creaked under Maylin's weight. But when she knocked on the door, the woman who answered had a face that reminded her so much of home that she almost started crying right there. "Kaya bang ni ma?" Mrs. Chen asked, then switched to English when she saw Maylin's hesitation. Can I help you? Elias Boone sent me. He said you might have a room. Mrs. Chen's eyes narrowed, not with hostility, but with the keen assessment of someone who'd survived by reading people quickly and accurately. Elias Boone sent you, she repeated like she was testing the words for truth. That man doesn't send people to me unless he thinks they deserve better than they've been getting. She stepped back, opening the door wider. You hungry? Maylin nodded before she could stop herself. Come in then. We'll talk about the room after you eat. Can't negotiate on an empty stomach. The interior of the boarding house was cramped but clean. Mismatched furniture crowded the small sitting room, and the smell of ginger and garlic hung in the air like a memory Maylin had been trying to forget. Mrs. Chen led her to a small kitchen where a pot of congee sat simmering on the stove. Sit, she commanded, and Maylin obeyed. The first spoonful of rice porridge tasted like every morning she'd spent in her grandmother's house, before everything fell apart. Simple, warm, safe. "You've been on the road a while," Mrs. Chen observed. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." "Running from something or running to something?" Maylin set down her spoon carefully. "Does it matter?" "Might." Mrs. Chen poured herself a cup of tea and settled into the chair across from Maylin. "Red Hollow's not an easy town for people like us. You planning to stay? I need to know you're not going to bring trouble I can't handle." "I don't want trouble." "Nobody ever wants it. Still finds us anyway." Mrs. Chen took a sip of her tea, her eyes never leaving Maylin's face. "You got family?" "Had family. Railroad camp fever took my father and brother last winter. My mother—" Maylin's throat closed up. "She died in California, before we came to Texas." Mrs. Chen nodded slowly. "And you've been alone since?" "Yes." "How old are you, girl?" 23. 23. Mrs. Chen shook her head. 23 and carrying the weight of someone twice your age. I can see it in your eyes. Maylin didn't know what to say to that. "I'll rent you the room upstairs," Mrs. Chen said abruptly. "Back corner. Window faces east, so you'll get morning light. $3 a week, and that includes breakfast. You'll need to find work to cover it, but I know some people who might hire you if you're willing to work hard." "I can work hard." "I'm sure you can." Mrs. Chen stood, brushing invisible crumbs from her apron. "But first, you need a bath. You smell like you've been sleeping in stables." For the first time in months, Maylin felt something that might have been the distant cousin of hope. The bath was a luxury Maylin had almost forgotten existed. Mrs. Chen heated the water herself, carrying buckets from the kitchen stove to the small washroom off the back of the house. The tub was old, chipped enamel that had seen better days, but it held water, and that was enough. "Take your time," Mrs. Chen said. "I'll leave soap and a towel here. When you're done, there's a robe on the hook. We'll see about getting you some proper clothes tomorrow." Alone in the washroom, Maylin stripped off her filthy traveling clothes with hands that shook. When was the last time she'd been truly clean? Sacramento, maybe. Before her father got sick, before everything started falling apart. The water was almost too hot, but she sank into it anyway, letting it cover her up to her chin. For the first few minutes, she just sat there, watching the dirt literally lift off her skin and turn the water gray. Then she started scrubbing. Every inch of exposed skin, every tangle in her hair, every reminder of the past 6 months on the road. She scrubbed until her skin turned pink, until her fingers pruned, until the water had gone completely cold. When she finally emerged, wrapped in Mrs. Chen's worn but clean robe, she caught sight of herself in the small mirror above the wash basin. The woman looking back at her was a stranger. Without the layers of grime, her face looked younger. The scar near her left temple, a souvenir from a broken bottle thrown by a drunk in some nameless town, stood out stark against her pale skin. Her eyes looked too large for her face, shadowed with exhaustion that no amount of sleep would fix. But she was clean. Mrs. Chen knocked softly on the door. "Everything all right?" "Yes," Maylin managed. "Thank you. Come downstairs when you're ready. I found some clothes that might fit." The clothes turned out to be a simple cotton dress, faded blue with small white flowers, and a warm shawl. They were too big, but Mrs. Chen had pins and competent hands, and within 20 minutes, Maylin was dressed in something that didn't smell like defeat. "Better," Mrs. Chen announced, standing back to assess her work. "Much better. Now you look like a person instead of a ghost." That night, Maylin slept in an actual bed for the first time in months. The mattress was thin and the springs creaked with every movement, but it was off the ground and relatively safe, and that was more than she'd had in a long time. She didn't sleep well. Years of survival had taught her body to stay alert even in rest. But she slept. And when she woke to sunlight streaming through the east-facing window, she allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that maybe things could be different here. That belief lasted exactly 3 days. The trouble started at the general store. Maylin had found work helping Mrs. Chen with laundry, hard, hot work that left her hands raw, but paid enough to cover her room and board with a little left over. On her 3rd day, Mrs. Chen had sent her to Henderson's general store to buy soap and starch. The store was busy. Farmers and ranchers crowded the aisles, their voices loud and their opinions louder. Maylin kept to the edges, trying to make herself small and invisible the way she'd learned to do. She found the soap easily enough, but the starch was on a high shelf just out of reach. She was standing on her toes, fingertips barely brushing the box, when someone shoved her from behind, hard. She stumbled forward, catching herself on the shelf, which promptly gave way with a screech of breaking wood. Boxes and bottles crashed to the floor around her in an explosion of noise that made everyone in the store turn and stare. "Clumsy Chinese fool," a woman's voice cut through the sudden silence. "Look what you've done." Maylin recognized the voice even before she turned around. Patricia Caldwell, the banker's wife, stood there with her arms crossed and an expression of profound disgust on her perfectly powdered face. "I'm sorry," Maylin stammered, dropping to her knees to start gathering the fallen items. "I'll clean it up. You'll pay for the damages is what you'll do," Patricia interrupted. "Every broken bottle, every dented can. Mr. Henderson, tally it up." Mr. Henderson, the store owner, looked uncomfortable. He was a thin man with thinning hair and the permanent stoop of someone who'd spent too many years counting other people's money. "Now, Mrs. Caldwell, it was just an accident. An accident she caused," Patricia snapped. "These people come into our town, take our resources, and then destroy our property. It's unacceptable." "I didn't—" Maylin tried to explain that someone had pushed her, but the words died in her throat when she saw the crowd gathering, all of them white, all of them watching her like she was some kind of criminal. "I saw her do it on purpose," a man volunteered from the back. Maylin didn't even know his name. "She was reaching for something and just pulled the whole shelf down." Lies. Complete lies. But who would believe her? "How much?" Maylin asked quietly, her hands still full of broken glass. Mr. Henderson tallied it up with visible reluctance. $3.50. Everything she'd earned in 3 days of backbreaking labor. Gone. Maylin reached into her pocket and pulled out the small leather pouch where she kept her wages. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely untie the strings. "Pathetic," Patricia muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Coming here with nothing, expecting us to support her. It's disgusting." Something inside Maylin snapped. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone would notice, but something fundamental shifted, like a bone setting wrong and healing crooked. She placed the money on the counter with exaggerated care, meeting Mr. Henderson's eyes for just a second before turning to leave. "And don't come back unless you can afford to pay for what you break," Patricia called after her. Maylin walked out of the store with her head high and her hands still bleeding from the broken glass. She made it 3 blocks before she had to stop and lean against a building, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps that had nothing to do with physical exertion. This was it. This was as good as it got. A clean dress and a rented room and people who would push her into shelves and blame her for falling. "Ma'am?" She looked up to find Elias standing there, his horse tied to a post nearby, concern written plainly across his scarred face. "What happened to your hands?" Maylin looked down. Blood had soaked through the hem of her dress where she'd been wiping her palms. "Broken glass. At the store." Elias's eyes narrowed. "Henderson's?" She nodded. "Stay here." He didn't wait for her to respond before striding toward the general store with the kind of purposeful walk that usually preceded either violence or justice, and sometimes both. Maylin should have left, should have gone back to Mrs. Chen's and bandaged her hands and accepted that this was her life now. But instead, she followed him, staying far enough back that she could pretend she wasn't. Inside the store, Elias had Mr. Henderson backed against the counter, his voice low and dangerous. "Pushed into the shelf?" "Mr. Boone, I don't know what she told you, but that's not what I asked. I asked if someone pushed her." Mr. Henderson's eyes darted around the store, looking for support that wasn't coming. There might have been some jostling. It's a crowded store. People bump into each other." "Who was standing behind her?" Silence. Elias let it stretch out, let it get uncomfortable, let it become unbearable. Finally, Mr. Henderson sighed. "Look, Mrs. Caldwell was... There were some words exchanged, but the shelf was already broken, had been meaning to fix it for weeks. So you charged her for your negligence." "Mr. Boone, give her the money back." Mr. Henderson's face went red. "Now see, here, I can't just..." "You can and you will." Elias's hand came down on the counter hard enough to rattle the items on display. Because if you don't, I'm going to make sure every rancher within 50 miles knows that Henderson's General Store cheats its customers. Won't matter much to me. I buy most of my supplies in Abilene anyway. But I reckon it'll matter to you. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Mr. Henderson counted out $3.50 with shaking hands. Elias took the money and walked past Mei Lin without a word, jerking his head toward the door in a clear signal to follow. Outside, he handed her the money. Your hands need tending. They're fine. That wasn't a question, ma'am. He untied his horse. Mrs. Chen's boarding house? I can walk myself. Didn't say you couldn't. Said your hands need tending. He swung into the saddle with practiced ease. You gonna argue with me all afternoon, or you gonna let me help before those cuts get infected? Mei Lin wanted to argue. Wanted to tell him she didn't need protecting, didn't need someone fighting her battles. But her hands hurt and she was tired, and the past hour had scraped away what little pride she'd managed to rebuild. Mrs. Chen's boarding house, she confirmed. Elias rode slowly beside her as she walked, not speaking, just a quiet presence between her and the rest of the town. When they reached Mrs. Chen's, he dismounted and tied his horse to the post outside. Mrs. Chen took one look at Mei Lin's hands and started issuing orders in rapid Cantonese mixed with English, pointing Elias toward the kitchen and Mei Lin toward the washroom. Sit, Mrs. Chen commanded once they were assembled in the kitchen. She had bandages, ointment, and a bowl of clean water laid out like she'd been preparing for surgery. Elias leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching as Mrs. Chen cleaned and wrapped Mei Lin's hands with the efficiency of someone who'd done this too many times before. What happened? Mrs. Chen asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. Mei Lin told her, leaving out nothing. Mrs. Chen's jaw tightened with each detail, but she didn't interrupt. When Mei Lin finished, she tied off the last bandage and sat back. Patricia Caldwell is a small woman with a small mind, Mrs. Chen said flatly. She thinks cruelty makes her powerful. All it makes her is cruel. She's not wrong, though, Mei Lin heard herself say. I'm just some railroad stray who wandered into town. I don't belong here. That's ridiculous, Elias said from his position by the wall. Both women turned to look at him. Nobody belongs anywhere, he continued. We all just choose places and try to make them work. My family came from Tennessee, fought on the wrong side of a war, lost everything, drifted west because there was nowhere else to go. You think people welcomed us with open arms? Hell no. We were Confederate trash in a Union town for the first 5 years. He pushed off from the wall, his expression intense. But we stayed, we worked. We proved we were more than what people assumed, and eventually some of them came around. Not all of them, but enough. I'm not you, Mei Lin said quietly. No, Elias agreed. You're not. You're facing worse than I ever did because people can see the difference on you just by looking. Can't hide who you are even if you wanted to. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. But that doesn't mean you don't belong. It just means you have to decide if you're going to let them push you out or if you're going to stand your ground. Mei Lin looked down at her bandaged hands. And if standing my ground gets me killed, then you'll have company, Elias said simply. Because I didn't ride into town just to watch good people get crushed by bad ones. Mrs. Chen made a small sound that might have been approval or exasperation or both. You're either very brave or very stupid, Mr. Boone, she observed. Elias smiled, a quick flash of something warm beneath the hard exterior. Most days? Both. For the first time since the incident at the store, Mei Lin felt something loosen in her chest. Not hope, exactly, but something close to it. That evening, after Elias had left and Mrs. Chen had gone to bed, Mei Lin sat by the window in her small room and watched the stars emerge one by one above Red Hollow. Tomorrow, she would face the same hostile town, the same suspicious glances and cruel whispers, but tomorrow she would do it with clean hands and a full stomach, and the strange knowledge that somewhere in this harsh Texas town there were at least 2 people who believed she deserved to exist. It wasn't much, but it was more than she'd had yesterday, and for now, that would have to be enough. The first week after the incident at Henderson's store passed in a strange blur of routine and tension. Mei Lin woke before dawn each day, helped Mrs. Chen with the laundry, and kept her head down whenever she ventured into town. The bandages came off her hands after 4 days, leaving behind pale scars that would probably never fade completely. Elias stopped by the boarding house every few days, usually with some excuse. He needed to talk to Mrs. Chen about ordering supplies, or his horse needed water, or he'd heard there was good coffee. The excuses were thin enough to see through, but nobody called him on it. On the 8th day, he showed up carrying a package wrapped in brown paper. Mrs. Chen answered the door, took one look at him, and called over her shoulder, "Mei Lin, your cowboy is here." "He's not my cowboy," Mei Lin replied from the kitchen, but she dried her hands and came to the door anyway. Elias stood on the porch, looking vaguely uncomfortable, the package tucked under one arm. "Morning." "Morning," Mei Lin echoed. "Mrs. Chen says you're my cowboy now." A faint flush crept up Elias's neck. "Mrs. Chen says a lot of things." "Most of them true," Mrs. Chen called from inside, not bothering to hide the fact that she was eavesdropping. Elias cleared his throat. "I brought you something. Well, I didn't buy it or anything, just found it in the bunkhouse at the ranch. Nobody's using it." He held out the package like it might bite him. Mei Lin took it slowly, aware that Mrs. Chen had materialized in the doorway behind her, watching with undisguised interest. The brown paper crinkled as she unwrapped it. Inside was a brush. Not fancy, just plain wood and bristles, but clean and well made. The kind of brush someone might use on a horse's mane. "For your hair," Elias said, then immediately looked like he regretted speaking. "I mean, you don't have to use it for that. Could use it for whatever. Just thought—" He stopped, visibly regrouping. One of the ranch hands left it behind when he moved on. Seemed like it might be useful. Mei Lin turned the brush over in her hands. Nobody had given her anything in so long. The canteen of water didn't count because he'd left it on the ground, technically. This required him to walk up and hand it to her directly, which somehow made it more significant. "Thank you," she managed. "It's just a brush." Still. They stood there in awkward silence until Mrs. Chen sighed loudly and pushed past Mei Lin. "Mr. Boone, have you eaten breakfast?" "Had some coffee at the ranch." "Coffee isn't breakfast. Come inside before the neighbors start inventing stories about why you're standing on my porch at dawn." Elias glanced at Mei Lin, a question in his eyes. She shrugged. When Mrs. Chen decided something, arguing was pointless. 10 minutes later, they were sitting at Mrs. Chen's cramped kitchen table while she bustled around making what she called a proper breakfast. Rice porridge with preserved vegetables and tea that was strong enough to strip paint. "So," Mrs. Chen said, settling into her chair with a cup of tea, "how long are you planning to dance around each other before one of you says what you're actually thinking?" Mei Lin nearly choked on her porridge. Elias, to his credit, didn't flinch. "Ma'am, I'm not sure what you mean." "Of course you don't." Mrs. Chen's expression was somewhere between amused and exasperated. "You show up here every 3 days with your terrible excuses and your careful manners, and she watches the road every afternoon around the time you usually arrive. But sure, nobody knows what I mean." "Mrs. Chen," Mei Lin hissed, mortified. "What? I'm old. I'm allowed to be direct." She took a sip of her tea. "Besides, Mr. Boone doesn't strike me as someone who scares easily. Do you, Mr. Boone?" "Depends on what's doing the scaring," Elias replied carefully. "Honest answer." Mrs. Chen nodded approval. "Here's another question then. What are your intentions toward this girl?" The silence that followed was excruciating. Finally, Elias set down his spoon and looked directly at Mei Lin. "I don't have intentions. I just think you deserve better than what this town's been giving you. And I figure if I can make that slightly less terrible, I should." "Why?" The question came out sharper than Mei Lin intended. "Because somebody should." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I've got." Mrs. Chen made a satisfied sound. "Good enough for now. Mei Lin, eat your breakfast. Mr. Boone, there's more porridge if you want it." The subject was apparently closed. After breakfast, Elias lingered on the porch while Mei Lin walked him to his horse. The morning sun was starting to burn off the early chill, promising another hot Texas day. "She's not subtle," Elias observed. "Never has been." Mei Lin ran her fingers along the brush he'd given her, still uncertain what to do with the strange warmth it created in her chest. You don't have to keep coming by. I'm managing fine. I know you are. Then why? Elias adjusted his hat, buying himself a moment. You ever feel like you're watching someone try to swim upstream and you know they're strong enough to make it, but the current's rigged against them anyway? Maylin thought about that. Yes, that's why. He swung into the saddle with easy grace. Also, Mrs. Chen makes terrible coffee, but her tea is the best I've had since my mother died. So there's that. Despite everything, Maylin smiled. She'll be pleased to hear it. Don't tell her she's already smug enough. He gathered the reins. You working today? Laundry, same as always. Hard work. I've done harder. Something shifted in Elias's expression. Recognition, maybe, or respect. I believe that. He rode off without another word, leaving Maylin standing on the porch with a horse brush and more questions than answers. Inside, Mrs. Chen was already starting the day's washing. She glanced at Maylin, but didn't comment on the flush in her cheeks or the way she kept touching the brush like she needed to confirm it was real. Some things, apparently, didn't need to be said out loud. The work was brutal. Hauling water, heating it in massive pots, scrubbing stains out of other people's sheets and shirts until her arms ached and her back screamed. Mrs. Chen worked alongside her without complaint, but she was in her 60s and Maylin could see the toll it took. By midday, they'd hung 3 loads on the lines behind the boarding house. Maylin was wringing out a particularly stubborn tablecloth when she heard voices from the front of the house. Male voices, loud and getting louder. Mrs. Chen heard it too, her hands stilled in the wash water. Stay here. Mrs. Chen, stay here, she repeated firmly, then wiped her hands on her apron and headed inside. Maylin stayed where she was for approximately 30 seconds before her curiosity and concern got the better of her. She followed quietly, stopping just inside the back door where she could hear without being seen. No right to be running a business here, a man was saying. Maylin recognized the voice. Carl Henderson, the store owner's younger brother. You're taking work away from honest folk. Honest folk like who? Mrs. Chen's voice was ice. Your sister-in-law who charges twice what the laundry in Abilene charges and returns clothes that smell like they've never seen soap? You watch your mouth. Or what, Mr. Henderson? You'll report me to someone? I have every right to run a business. I pay my fees to the town. I don't break any laws. What I do break is your sister-in-law's monopoly on overpriced, substandard work. There was a pause. Then another voice joined in, this one younger. Maybe we should help you understand that you're not welcome here. The threat in those words made Maylin's blood run cold. She stepped into the front room before she could talk herself out of it. 3 men stood in Mrs. Chen's sitting room. Carl Henderson, his nephew James, and a ranch hand Maylin didn't recognize. They all turned to stare at her. Well, well, James sneered. The little China doll. Heard you've been causing trouble. I haven't caused anything, Maylin said quietly. Just your existence causes trouble, Carl cut in. You and Chen here, taking work that should go to Americans. Mrs. Chen is American, Maylin pointed out. She's lived here for 20 years. That doesn't make her one of us. The casual dismissal in his voice was somehow worse than outright hatred. Like he'd decided long ago that some people simply didn't count, and nothing would change his mind. Mrs. Chen stepped forward, positioning herself slightly in front of Maylin. Gentlemen, I believe we're done here. You've said your piece. The door is behind you. We're done when we say we're done, James shot back. He took a step toward them, and Maylin's hand instinctively went to her pocket, where she kept the small knife she'd carried since Sacramento. She'd never actually used it on a person, but she would if she had to. The door opened. Elias filled the doorway, and the temperature in the room immediately dropped 10 degrees. Heard voices, he said mildly, but there was nothing mild about the way he looked at the 3 men. Thought I'd check if everything was all right. This isn't your business, Boone, Carl blustered. Funny thing about that. Elias stepped fully into the room, somehow making it feel smaller just by being there. I make Mrs. Chen's business my business. Has been for the past 5 years, ever since she took in my ranch hand's mother when everyone else turned her away. So when I hear 3 men raising their voices in her house, I take an interest. We were just leaving, Elias finished. You were just leaving, all 3 of you. James opened his mouth to argue, saw the expression on Elias's face, and thought better of it. They filed out in sullen silence, Carl muttering something under his breath about people who don't know their place. When they were gone, Mrs. Chen let out a long breath. "Thank you, Mr. Boone." "You all right?" Elias asked, looking between them. "Fine," Mrs. Chen said, but Mei Lin could see her hands shaking slightly. "Just the usual stupidity." Elias turned to Mei Lin. "You?" She realized she still had her hand in her pocket, fingers wrapped around the knife. She let go slowly. "I'm okay." "Good." He didn't look entirely convinced. "This going to be a regular thing? People coming here to harass you?" Mrs. Chen sighed. "Probably. Patricia Caldwell's been spreading rumors that we're taking business from her sister-in-law. Some people are choosing to believe we're the problem instead of acknowledging that Martha Henderson couldn't wash a dish properly if her life depended on it." "Competition," Elias said. "They don't like it." "They don't like us," Mei Lin corrected. "The competition is just an excuse." He couldn't argue with that. That night, Elias didn't leave after dinner like he usually did. Instead, he settled into one of Mrs. Chen's battered armchairs and announced he'd be sleeping on the porch. "That's not necessary," Mrs. Chen protested, though she didn't sound particularly committed to the argument. "Maybe not. Doing it anyway." He stretched his legs out. "Anyone comes by tonight, they'll find me before they find you." Mei Lin wanted to argue that they didn't need protecting, that they'd managed fine before he showed up. But the truth was, having him there made the knot of anxiety in her chest loosen just slightly. "Suit yourself," Mrs. Chen said. "I'll get you a blanket." Upstairs in her room, Mei Lin couldn't sleep. She sat by the window watching the street below where Elias had positioned himself on the porch, his rifle across his lap. The brush he'd given her sat on the small table beside her bed. She'd used it that evening, working slowly through the tangles in her hair. It had taken nearly an hour, and her arms had ached by the end, but when she finished, her hair fell smooth and dark down her back for the first time in months. Such a small thing. A brush? Clean hair. But somehow it felt like reclaiming something she'd lost piece by piece over the past year, some small part of herself that she'd thought was gone forever. Below, Elias shifted position, the porch boards creaking under his weight. Mei Lin pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders and watched the empty street until exhaustion finally pulled her under. The harassment didn't stop, but it changed form. Instead of direct confrontation, it became a campaign of small cruelties. Customers who'd promised to pick up their laundry suddenly claimed they'd never made such arrangements. Someone spread a rumor that Mrs. Chen's water supply was contaminated. The general store stopped selling them soap, claimed they were out of stock, but Mei Lin had seen the shipment arrive just that morning. They adapted, bought soap from the next town over, kept meticulous records of every transaction, worked twice as hard to prove they were twice as good. And Elias kept showing up, sometimes with excuses, sometimes without. He fixed the porch railing that had been loose for months, helped haul water when Mrs. Chen's back was particularly bad, sat on the porch in the evenings, a quiet deterrent to anyone thinking about causing trouble. 2 weeks after the confrontation, he showed up in the late afternoon carrying a saddle. "Need your help with something," he announced without preamble. Mrs. Chen raised an eyebrow. "With a saddle?" "With teaching someone to ride." He looked directly at Mei Lin. "You ever been on a horse?" "No," Mei Lin said warily. "Why?" "Because if you're staying in Texas, you should know how. It's dangerous not to." He set the saddle on the porch. "Ranch is about 3 miles out. Trail's easy. You willing?" Mei Lin looked at Mrs. Chen, who shrugged. "Go, we're caught up on work for the day. Just be back before dark." 20 minutes later, Mei Lin found herself standing next to a horse that looked entirely too large and too unpredictable. "This is Maple," Elias said, running a hand along the mare's neck. "She's old, she's patient, and she's not easily spooked. Best horse to learn on." "She's enormous." "She's actually on the smaller side." He picked up the saddle. "Come here. I'll show you how this works." For the next hour, Elias walked her through everything: how to approach a horse, how to saddle it, how to check the girth and adjust the stirrups. His hands were steady and sure, and he explained things without condescension, just clear, practical instruction. "All right," he said finally. "Time to get on." Mei Lin stared at the stirrup like it was a personal enemy. "What if I fall?" "Then you fall. Ground's right there. It'll catch you." He held the horse steady. Left foot in the stirrup. Grab the saddle horn. Swing your right leg over. It took 3 tries. The first time she got her foot in the stirrup and froze. The second time she got halfway up and lost her nerve. The third time Elias put his hand on her back, firm, steadying, and said quietly, "I've got you. You're not going to fall." She swung up into the saddle. The ground looked very far away suddenly. "Breathe," Elias instructed. "You're holding the reins like you're trying to strangle them. Loosen up." Maylin tried to relax her death grip. "Better. Now Maple here is going to walk in a circle around the paddock. All you have to do is sit there and get used to the movement. Ready?" "No." "Good." He clicked his tongue and the horse started moving. The first few steps were terrifying. Maylin felt completely out of control, certain she was going to slide right off. But Elias walked beside them, one hand on the bridle, steady and calm, and gradually she found the rhythm of it. "There you go," he encouraged. "You're doing fine." "I'm not doing anything. The horse is doing everything." "You're staying on. That's something." They circled the paddock 5 times before Elias called a halt. When Maylin dismounted, less gracefully than she'd hoped, her legs felt like water. "How do you do this all day? Why?" she gasped, leaning against the fence. "Practice. You'll build the muscles for it." He started unsaddling Maple. "Come back tomorrow. We'll do it again." "Tomorrow?" "Unless you've got something better to do." Maylin thought about the laundry waiting back at the boarding house, the hostile stares in town, the constant low-level anxiety of existing in a place that didn't want her. "I'll be here," she said. And she was. Every afternoon for the next week, she showed up at the ranch and Elias taught her to ride. Not fancy riding, just the basics of how to control a horse, how to read its mood, how to stay on when the ground got rough. It was harder than anything she'd done in the railroad camps. Her muscles screamed. She fell twice, both times landing hard enough to knock the wind out of her. But she got back on. On the 8th day, Elias led her out of the paddock and onto the open trail. "We're going to ride to the creek and back," he announced. "About 2 miles. You set the pace." Maylin's hands tightened on the reins, but she nodded. The Texas landscape stretched out around them, endless sky, scrubby vegetation, the kind of emptiness that could swallow a person whole if they weren't careful. But from horseback, it looked different, less threatening, almost beautiful. They rode in comfortable silence, just the sound of hooves on packed earth and the occasional call of a bird overhead. When they reached the creek, Elias dismounted and led both horses to the water. Maylin slid off Maple less awkwardly than before, pleased with the small improvement. "You're a natural," Elias observed, checking Maple's hooves for stones. "I'm barely competent." "Barely competent is better than most people manage in a week." He straightened, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You ever think about doing something other than laundry?" The question caught her off guard. "Like what?" "Ranch work. We're always short-handed. Could use someone who's willing to learn and doesn't mind hard labor." Maylin's first instinct was to laugh. The idea of her, Chinese, female, barely tolerated in town, working on a ranch was absurd, but Elias looked completely serious. "Your boss would never allow it," she said finally. "I'm the foreman. I do the hiring." He kicked at a loose stone. "Pay's not great, but it's steady. Room and board included if you want it. Better than breathing in soap fumes all day." "Mrs. Chen needs help." "Mrs. Chen's been doing laundry for 20 years. She'll manage." He met her eyes. "I'm not saying you have to decide now. Just think about it." Maylin looked out at the creek, watching the water flow past. A month ago, she'd been sleeping in alleys and eating whatever she could scavenge. Now a cowboy was offering her a job on a ranch. The world was strange. "I'll think about it," she said. They rode back as the sun started its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded Maylin of the sunsets in California, back when her family was still whole and the future still held possibility. "Can I ask you something?" she said as they approached the ranch. "Sure." "Why do you care?" "Really? Not the answer about your sister or about being the person who doesn't just stand there. The real reason." Elias was quiet for so long she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he sighed, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. "You know what the worst part of war is?" he asked. "It's not the dying. It's watching people you thought were decent turn into something else because everyone around them is doing terrible things. And after a while, Terrible starts to feel normal. He guided his horse around a rough patch in the trail. I was 16 when I enlisted. Lied about my age. Thought war would make me a man, make me matter. His jaw tightened. Instead, I watched men burn farmhouses with families still inside. Watched them laugh about it after. Good men. Men who went to church and had wives and children waiting for them. Maylin said nothing, sensing he needed to finish. After the war ended, I came out here to get away from all that. Told myself I'd be different. I'd be better. But it's easy to be better when nobody's testing you. He looked at her. You showed up covered in dirt with the whole town against you, and I realized this is the test. Right here. Do I stand up or do I look away like everyone else? And if standing up gets you hurt, then I guess I get hurt. He said it simply, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. But at least I won't have to live with being the person who looked away. They reached the ranch just as full dark settled over the land. Elias helped her dismount, his hands careful and proper on her waist. Tomorrow? He asked. Tomorrow, she confirmed. Walking back to town under a sky full of stars, Maylin realized something had shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way that would show up on any map, but she wasn't running anymore. And that somehow changed everything. Mrs. Chen didn't take the news well. A ranch, she repeated, her hand stilling in the wash water. You want to leave laundry work to go live on a ranch with a bunch of cowboys. I haven't decided yet, Maylin said, scrubbing harder at the shirt in her hands. Elias just mentioned it as a possibility. Elias? Mrs. Chen's tone made the name sound like an accusation. Of course he did. They worked in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the slosh of water and the rhythmic scraping of washboards. You think it's a bad idea, Maylin finally said. Mrs. Chen dumped a load of rinsed clothes into the basket with more force than necessary. I think men make promises they don't always keep. I think ranch work is dangerous. I think you're finally safe here, and going out there puts you back in the line of fire. I'm not safe here. You know that. Safer than you'll be surrounded by ranch hands who might decide a Chinese woman is fair game for... She stopped, but the implication hung in the air between them. Maylin set down her washboard. Elias wouldn't let that happen. Elias is one man. What happens when he's not there? It was a fair question, one Maylin had asked herself a dozen times since the offer was made. I can't do laundry forever, she said quietly. My back already hurts every morning. You've been doing this for 20 years, and look what it's done to your hands. Mrs. Chen glanced down at her gnarled fingers, swollen at the knuckles from decades of harsh soap and cold water. It's honest work. So is ranch work. It's not the same, and you know it. Mrs. Chen's voice softened slightly. I'm not saying don't go. I'm saying be careful. Men like Elias Boone, they mean well. They really do. But the world doesn't care about good intentions. Then what should I do? Mrs. Chen was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant. My husband used to say that surviving meant knowing when to fight and when to run. Took me years to understand he was wrong. Sometimes surviving means standing still and making them move around you. I don't understand. You will. Mrs. Chen lifted the wash basket with a grunt. Help me hang these, then go. If you're going to learn ranching, might as well do it properly. The subject was closed, but Maylin caught the tightness around Mrs. Chen's eyes as they worked. The older woman had lost people before. That much was obvious. She was watching Maylin prepare to walk into danger and couldn't do anything to stop it. That evening, Maylin told Elias she'd take the job. He nodded like he'd expected it. You'll start Monday. I'll talk to the boss, get everything arranged. What if he says no? He won't. Elias adjusted his hat. Thomas Mackenzie's a practical man. He needs workers who show up and do the job. Everything else is noise. Monday came faster than Maylin was ready for. She packed her few belongings into the same cloth sack she'd carried into Red Hollow, said goodbye to Mrs. Chen, who hugged her fiercely and made her promise to visit, and rode out to Lone Cedar Ranch on Maple, the patient mare she'd been learning on. The ranch sprawled across several hundred acres of scrubland, with a main house, 2 bunkhouses, a barn, and various outbuildings scattered across the property. Cattle grazed in distant pastures, small dark shapes against the brown landscape. Thomas Mackenzie turned out to be a weathered man in his 50s with a limp he never explained and eyes that missed nothing. He looked Mei Lin up and down when Elias brought her to the main house, his expression unreadable. "You're the one Boone's been teaching to ride," he said finally. "Yes, sir." "He says you're a hard worker." "I try to be." Mackenzie grunted. "We'll see. Pays $20 a month plus room and board. You'll bunk in the smaller house with the other hands. Work starts at dawn, ends when the work's done. You break something expensive, it comes out of your pay. You steal, you're gone. You cause trouble, you're gone. Understood?" "Understood." "Good." He turned to Elias. "She's your responsibility. Anything goes wrong, I'm holding you accountable." "Fair enough," Elias agreed. The bunkhouse was rough. Wooden walls, narrow cots, a potbelly stove in the center for heat. 5 other ranch hands lived there, all men, all watching Mei Lin with varying degrees of suspicion when Elias showed her to an empty cot in the corner. "This is Mei Lin," Elias announced to the room. "She's working here now. Anyone has a problem with that, they can take it up with me." Silence greeted this declaration. A thin man with a tobacco-stained beard finally spoke up. "She gonna pull her weight, or are we covering for her?" "She'll pull her weight," Elias said flatly. "Same as everyone else." Another man, younger with a bad sunburn across his nose, snorted. "Right, because Chinese girls are known for ranch work. You got something to say, Peters?" Elias's voice dropped to a dangerous quiet. Peters looked away. "Just making an observation." "Observe less, work more." Elias turned to Mei Lin. "Get settled, we start in an hour." The work was brutal in ways that made laundry look gentle, mending fences under the blazing sun, hauling feed to cattle scattered across impossible distances, mucking out stables that smelled like concentrated misery, breaking ice on water troughs in the early morning cold. Mei Lin's muscles screamed, her hands blistered. She fell asleep each night, too exhausted to dream. But she didn't quit. The other ranch hands watched her with varying degrees of skepticism. Peters openly mocked her struggles. A massive man named Dutch ignored her completely. But 2 of them, an older hand named Charlie and a quiet Mexican worker named Rafael, treated her with careful neutrality that might eventually turn into acceptance. "Don't mind Peters," Charlie told her one evening as they repaired a section of fence. "He gives everyone hell their first month. If you last, he'll ease up." "And if I don't last?" Charlie hammered in a nail with practiced efficiency. "Then he'll have been right, and you'll have been gone. Either way, the problem solves itself." "That's comforting." "Wasn't trying to comfort you, was trying to tell you how it is." He glanced at her. "You've done manual labor before." It wasn't a question. "Railroad camps," Maitland confirmed, "after my father died." "Thought so. You hold a hammer like someone who's used one." He moved to the next post. "Peters holds a hammer like he's trying to kill it. That's how I know he's full of shit about you not pulling your weight." It was the closest thing to a compliment Mei Lin had received since arriving at the ranch. 3 weeks in, everything went wrong. They were moving a herd of cattle from one pasture to another. Simple work, or it should have been. But one of the steers spooked at something, maybe a snake, maybe just shadows. It bolted, and suddenly the whole herd was moving, panic spreading like fire. "Turn them," Elias shouted from somewhere to Mei Lin's left. "Turn them before they scatter." Mei Lin dug her heels into Maple's sides, trying to get ahead of the stampeding cattle, trying to remember everything Elias had taught her about controlling a horse at speed. The mare responded gamely, but the cattle were faster, driven by blind terror. She saw Peters ahead, his horse wheeling to cut off the lead animals, saw Dutch charging from the right, saw the whole carefully orchestrated plan falling apart as the cattle split into smaller groups, each heading in different directions. Then she saw the fence, old barbed wire, rusted and sagging, separating Mackenzie's land from the neighboring property. If the cattle hit that fence at full speed, half of them would get tangled in the wire, injured, maybe killed. Without thinking, Mei Lin urged Maple into a dead run, angling to cut off the lead steer. The wind tore at her face. The ground blurred beneath her. She got ahead of the steer, turned Maple hard, and the mare responded beautifully, swinging sideways to block the animal's path. The steer tried to dodge. Maple matched it. Behind them, the rest of the herd slowed, confused by the sudden obstacle. Other ranch hands caught up, forming a loose perimeter that gradually turned the cattle back toward the correct pasture. When it was over, Maylin's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the reins. Elias rode up beside her, his face flushed with exertion. That was either the bravest thing I've seen or the stupidest. Probably both, Maylin managed. Probably. He looked at her with something that might have been pride. But you stopped them. That fence would have been a massacre. Peters rode past, deliberately not looking at her. But Charlie caught her eye and gave a brief nod. It wasn't acceptance, but it was acknowledgement. That night in the bunkhouse, the atmosphere shifted slightly. Not enough to call it friendly, but the hostility had dulled to simple wariness. "You ride pretty good," Raphael said quietly, as they were settling in for the night. "For someone who just learned." "Had a good teacher," Maylin replied. "Boone's all right," Raphael agreed. "Tough, but fair. Better than the last foreman we had." "What happened to him?" "Got caught skimming from the payroll. Mackenzie fired him on the spot." Raphael blew out his candle. "This is a good place to work if you don't steal and you do what you're told. Not many ranches would have hired me after—" He stopped. "Well, after." Maylin didn't push. Everyone had an after. Some just wore it closer to the surface than others. The trouble, when it came, arrived on a Saturday. Most of the hands had ridden into Red Hollow for their weekly taste of civilization. Drinking, gambling, whatever else men did when they had money and time. Maylin had stayed behind, not eager to face the town's hostility on her day off. She was in the barn, brushing down Maple, when she heard voices outside. Male voices, slurred with drink. Her stomach dropped. "Saw her riding out here," someone was saying. "Chinese whore thinks she can work a ranch." Frank Morrison, the same man who'd kicked her awake in the alley all those weeks ago. "Should teach her a lesson," another voice added. "Show her what happens when you don't know your place." Maylin's hand went to her pocket, but the knife wasn't there. She'd left it in the bunkhouse. The barn door swung open, 3 men silhouetted against the afternoon sun. Frank, his brother Dale, and someone Maylin didn't recognize. All of them drunk enough to be dangerous, but not enough to be incapacitated. "Well, well," Frank drawled. "All alone out here. Where's your cowboy protector?" "In town," Maylin said, trying to keep her voice steady. "He'll be back soon." "That's so." Frank took a step closer. "Maybe we'll be done before then." Maylin backed up until she hit the stall door. Maple shifted nervously, sensing the tension. "You should leave," she said. "Should we?" Dale laughed. "You gonna make us, little China girl?" They spread out, blocking the exit. Maylin's mind raced through options. Fight. She'd lose. Scream. No one would hear. Run. They'd catch her. She was out of good choices. Frank lunged. Maylin ducked sideways, grabbing a pitchfork leaning against the stall. She swung it in a wide arc that caught Frank in the shoulder. Not hard enough to seriously injure, but enough to make him stagger back, cursing. "Bitch!" Dale came at her from the side. Maylin turned too late, and his fist connected with her ribs, driving the air from her lungs. She went down hard, the pitchfork clattering away. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard Maple whinny sharply. Then everything happened at once. The barn door slammed open with enough force to bounce off the wall. Elias's voice cut through the chaos like a whip. "Get away from her!" Frank and Dale turned. The third man bolted immediately, smart enough to recognize real danger when he saw it. "Boone," Frank said, trying for bravado and failing. "We were just—" "I don't care what excuse you were about to make." Elias's gun wasn't drawn, but his hand rested on it with casual menace. "You've got 3 seconds to get off this property before I decide whether witnesses matter. You can't—" "1." Dale grabbed Frank's arm. "Come on, let's go." 2. They scrambled for the door, nearly tripping over each other in their haste. Elias waited until they were gone before crossing to where Maylin was struggling to stand. He helped her up with gentle hands that shook slightly. "You hurt?" "Ribs," she gasped, "but I don't think anything's broken." "Lucky." His jaw was tight with barely controlled fury. "I shouldn't have left you alone. I knew there was tension in town. Should have known some drunk idiot would—" "It's not your fault. Like hell it isn't." He helped her to a hay bale and eased her down. "I'm supposed to keep you safe." "You're not my keeper, Elias." "No, but I'm the one who convinced you to work here, which makes this my responsibility." Maylin pressed a hand to her ribs, testing for damage. Pain, but manageable. They would have come after me wherever I was. At least here you showed up in time. That seemed to deflate some of his anger. I came back early. Had a feeling something was off. He looked at her seriously. You can't stay in the bunkhouse anymore. Not after this. Where else would I go? There's a small room off the tack shed. Used to be for the stable master before Mackenzie consolidated the buildings. It's not much, but it has a door that locks. The other hands will talk. Let them. Elias stood. I'll help you move your things. Then I'm going into town to have a conversation with the Morrison brothers. Elias, not asking for permission. His voice was flat. Some things need to be said clearly. They came onto Mackenzie's property and assaulted one of his workers. That doesn't stand. He left before she could argue further. The room off the tack shed was tiny, barely large enough for a cot, a small table, and a hook for hanging clothes. But it was private, and the door had a heavy bolt on the inside. Charlie helped her move her few possessions, his usual taciturn nature even quieter than usual. Heard what happened, he said as they finished. Morrison boys are mean drunks. Always have been. Seems like everyone in Red Hollow is mean something. Not everyone. He adjusted his hat. Town's scared, that's all. Railroad came through, brought workers who looked different, talked different. Some people handle fear by getting angry. Makes them feel powerful. And the rest? Rest of us just try to do our jobs and stay out of it. He paused at the door. For what it's worth, you did good with that steer stampede. Took guts. It was the longest speech she'd heard from Charlie. She took it for what it was. Acceptance, finally, from at least one corner of this hostile world. That night, alone in her small room, Mei Lin lay on the cot and stared at the ceiling. Her ribs ached. Her pride ached worse. She'd survived worse than Frank Morrison, survived losing her family, survived months on the road, survived starvation and violence and the casual cruelty of a world that had decided she didn't matter. But something about today had broken through the protective numbness she'd built around herself. Maybe it was realizing that even here, even with Elias's protection and Charlie's grudging acceptance, she was still just one drunk man away from disaster. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe she was just tired of being afraid. When Elias returned late that evening, his knuckles were split and there was blood on his shirt that probably wasn't his. He didn't explain and she didn't ask. The next week was tense. Word spread about the incident in the barn, and opinions divided sharply. Some townspeople muttered that Mei Lin had probably provoked the Morrison brothers. Others suggested that maybe having a woman on the ranch was asking for trouble. But a very few, started looking at her differently. Like maybe she wasn't just some foreign problem to be solved. Like maybe she was a person who'd defended herself with a pitchfork and lived to tell about it. Work continued. Fences still needed mending. Cattle still needed tending. The ranch didn't stop for drama. Mei Lin threw herself into it, working harder than necessary, pushing her body until exhaustion blocked out thought. Elias watched her with concern but didn't interfere. Raphael started teaching her to use a lasso. Might need it, was all he said by way of explanation. Charlie showed her how to read the sky for weather changes, how to know when a storm was coming hours before the first clouds appeared. Even Dutch, the massive silent man who'd ignored her for weeks, grunted at her one morning in what might have been greeting. Small things, tiny shifts in an atmosphere that had been actively hostile just weeks before. But shifts nonetheless. One evening, Elias found her sitting outside her small room, watching the sunset paint the western sky in violent shades of orange and red. Mind if I sit? He asked. She gestured to the ground beside her. They sat in silence for a while, watching the day die in spectacular fashion. My sister loved sunsets, Elias said eventually. Used to say they were proof that endings could be beautiful. What do you think? I think they're proof that even the sun gets tired. He picked up a small stone, turned it over in his fingers. You doing all right? Define all right. Fair point. He tossed the stone into the growing darkness. Mackenzie's pleased with your work. Said you've got good instincts. That's surprising, considering. Considering what? Considering I'm a Chinese woman working a job that everyone thinks I shouldn't have. Elias was quiet for a moment. You know what Mackenzie said when I first told him I wanted to hire you? He said, I don't care if she's got 3 heads and speaks in tongues, long as she shows up and works. That's all that matters to him. Results. Must be nice, Maylin said, to live in a world where that's all that matters. It's not all that matters, but it's what should matter. He looked at her. You proved yourself. That's more than most people ever do. I got attacked in a barn, and you fought back. Then you showed up the next day and kept working. He shook his head. Most people would have run. Hell, most people would have been justified in running. Where would I run to? The question came out more bitter than she intended. Red Hollow doesn't want me. The next town won't want me either. Eventually you run out of places to run. So you stay. So I stay. She pulled her knees up to her chest. Doesn't mean I'm not still scared. Being scared just means you're paying attention. Elias stood, brushing dust from his pants. Get some rest. Tomorrow we're driving cattle to the north pasture. Long day. He started to walk away, then stopped. Maylin? Yeah? I meant what I said before, about standing up instead of looking away. His silhouette was dark against the fading light. Some days that's harder than others, but it's still worth doing. After he left, Maylin sat alone with her thoughts and the endless Texas sky. Worth doing. She turned the phrase over in her mind like Raphael turning a rope, looking for weaknesses, testing its strength. Was it worth it? The constant vigilance? The exhausting fight to simply exist in a place that didn't want her? The knowledge that one mistake, one moment of vulnerability could end in violence? She didn't have an answer, but she also didn't get up and start packing. So maybe that was an answer in itself. The storm that would change everything started as a whisper on the wind 3 days later. Charlie noticed it first. He straightened from checking a fence post, tilted his head toward the western horizon, and spat into the dust. Bad one coming, he announced. Maylin looked up from the wire she was unspooling. The sky was still clear, the sun bright enough to make her squint. How can you tell? The air feels different, heavy. He wiped sweat from his forehead. You spend enough years out here, you learn to read what's coming before you can see it. By evening, the sky had turned an ugly yellow-green color that made Maylin's skin crawl. The cattle were restless, lowing and shifting in their pens. Even the horses seemed nervous, ears swiveling at sounds only they could hear. Mackenzie called all the hands to the main house just after sunset. Storm's going to hit tonight, he said without preamble. Big one from the look of it. Lightning, high winds, maybe hail. I want everyone ready. Livestock secured, anything that can blow away tied down or brought inside. We do this right. We'll lose some shingles and sleep. We do it wrong. We lose a lot more. They scattered to their tasks. Maylin worked alongside Raphael, securing the barn doors and moving tools and equipment into storage sheds. The wind was already picking up, hot and dry, and smelling faintly of electricity. You been through a bad storm before? Raphael asked as they wrestled a section of loose roofing into place. Sacramento flooded once. That was bad. This'll be different. Texas storms don't mess around. He hammered a nail with practiced efficiency. Lightning can split a tree clean in half. Hail can kill a steer if it hits right. And the wind? He shook his head. Wind out here gets mean. They finished just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. Not gentle rain, angry rain that hit like thrown pebbles. Get inside, Elias shouted over the rising wind. Everyone to the bunkhouse or main house, now! Maylin ran for her small room off the tack shed. She'd barely gotten the door closed when the full force of the storm hit. The wind screamed, rain hammered the roof with such violence that she could barely hear herself think. Lightning turned the world white every few seconds, followed by thunder that shook the walls. She sat on her cot, knees pulled to her chest, and tried not to think about what would happen if the roof gave way. The room wasn't much, but it was hers. The first space she'd had to herself since her mother died. The thought of losing it to wind and water made something in her chest tighten. An hour into the storm, she smelled smoke. At first she thought she was imagining it, but the smell grew stronger, acrid and sharp, cutting through even the rain. She cracked open the door and immediately understood. Lightning had struck one of the outbuildings, a storage shed about 50 yards from the main barn. Flames were already licking up the walls despite the rain, fed by the oil-soaked lumber and whatever flammable supplies were stored inside. Maylin's first thought was to run for help. Her second was that there was no time. The shed was dangerously close to the barn. If the fire spread to the hay stored there, the whole structure would go up, and the horses were in that barn. She grabbed a bucket from beside the water trough and ran. The rain was so heavy she could barely see 3 feet ahead. The wind tried to knock her sideways with every step, but she made it to the trough, filled the bucket, and threw water at the base of the fire. It was like spitting at an inferno. The flames barely noticed. "What the hell are you doing?" She turned to find Elias running toward her, Dutch and Charlie close behind. "The barn!" she shouted over the storm. "If the fire spreads—" "I know," Elias grabbed her arm. "You can't fight this alone. Get to the barn and get those horses out. We'll handle the fire." Maylin didn't argue. She dropped the bucket and ran for the barn. Inside, the horses were panicking. The smell of smoke had reached them, and they were throwing themselves against their stall doors, eyes rolling white with terror. "Easy, easy," Maylin tried to say, but her voice was lost in the chaos. She grabbed the first halter she could find and approached Maple's stall. The mare was usually calm, but fear had stripped away all her training. She reared when Maylin opened the door, hooves flashing dangerously close to Maylin's head. "Maple, it's me," Maylin said, trying to project calm she didn't feel. "We need to go. Now!" The mare's ears swiveled toward her voice. For a moment, they locked eyes. Maylin slipped the halter on and led Maple out of the stall. The mare followed, trembling but trusting. 1 down, 5 to go. The next horse, a gelding named Buck, was easier. He practically bolted out of his stall the moment the door opened, nearly trampling Maylin in his haste to escape. The third horse fought her, a young stallion named Thunder who lived up to his name by trying to bite and kick anything within reach. Maylin grabbed a rope and did her best to get it around his neck, but he was too strong, too scared. "Come on," she pleaded, aware that smoke was starting to seep under the barn door. "Don't be stupid." Thunder reared again, and this time his hoof caught her shoulder, sending her sprawling into the dirt. Pain exploded through her left side. She tried to stand and her arm wouldn't cooperate properly. "Move!" Raphael appeared out of nowhere, grabbed Thunder's rope with both hands, and hauled the stallion toward the door through sheer determination. "You all right?" he asked without looking at her. "Shoulder," Maylin gasped. "But I can still work." "Then work." 3 more horses. They got the remaining horses out in less than 5 minutes that felt like hours. By the time they led the last one, an old mare named Bess, into the relative safety of the open paddock, the storage shed had collapsed in on itself, sending up a shower of sparks that the rain immediately extinguished. Elias and the others had formed a bucket line from the water trough, throwing water not at the burning shed but at the barn, keeping the wooden walls wet enough that the flames couldn't catch. It was brutal, exhausting work. Maylin joined the line despite her injured shoulder, passing buckets with her good arm and trying not to think about the pain. The storm raged on. The fire fought back. For a terrible moment, it looked like they might lose. Then the wind shifted. The flames, which had been reaching toward the barn like grasping fingers, suddenly bent away, driven back by a gust that seemed to come from nowhere. The rain intensified, coming down in sheets so thick they could barely breathe. And slowly, impossibly, the fire began to die. When it was finally over, the fire reduced to smoking debris and the storm starting to move east, they stood in the mud and rain, exhausted beyond words. "Everyone accounted for?" Mackenzie called out, his voice hoarse. "All here," Elias confirmed. "Some injuries, but nothing critical." "Horses?" "Safe. Maylin got them out." Mackenzie turned to look at her, his weathered face unreadable in the darkness. "That true?" Maylin nodded, too tired to speak. "Good work." He coughed, clearing smoke from his lungs. "Charlie, check the property for damage. Raphael, make sure all the animals are secure. Everyone else, get some rest. We'll assess in the morning." They dispersed slowly, moving like people twice their age. Elias caught up with Maylin as she headed toward her room. "Let me see that shoulder." "It's fine." That wasn't a request. He steered her toward the main house, where lamplight still glowed in the windows. "You got kicked by a half-ton horse. You're getting it checked." Inside, Mackenzie's wife, a sturdy woman named Margaret, who Maylin had met only briefly, took one look at Maylin's shoulder and started issuing orders. "Shirt off. Elias, get the medical kit. Thomas, put water on to boil." "I'm fine," Maylin tried again. "Of course you are. Shirt off anyway." Elias diplomatically turned his back while Maylin peeled off her soaked shirt, wincing as the fabric pulled away from her injured shoulder. Margaret's hands were surprisingly gentle as she examined the damage. Bruised bad. Might be a small fracture, but I don't think so. You won't be able to lift anything heavy for a week at least. I can work. You can work doing things that don't require that arm. Margaret started wrapping the shoulder with practiced efficiency. Stubborn won't fix broken bones faster, girl. Trust me on that. When she finished, she handed Mei Lin a clean shirt, one of Mackenzie's, large enough to fit over the bandages. You did good tonight. Saved those horses. Probably saved the barn too. I was just doing what needed doing, I know. That's more than most people manage. Margaret patted her good shoulder. Get some rest. Morning's going to come whether you're ready or not. Mei Lin's room had survived the storm mostly intact. A few leaks in the roof, water pooling in one corner, but the structure held. She was trying to mop up the water one-handed when Elias appeared in the doorway. Need help? She wanted to say no. Wanted to prove she could handle this herself, that she didn't need rescuing every time something went wrong. But her shoulder throbbed, and the water was spreading, and she was so tired her bones ached. Yes, she admitted. They worked in silence, Elias pushing the water out the door while Mei Lin stuffed rags into the roof leaks to slow the dripping. When they finished, he helped her arrange some blankets to keep the remaining dry spots dry. Thank you, she said when he was done. You keep thanking me for basic human decency. He leaned against the doorframe. That's depressing. Most people's basic decency doesn't extend to me. Then most people are trash. He said it simply, like it was an obvious fact. You ran into a burning building to save horses. That matters more than what you look like or where you came from. Does it? Mei Lin sat on her cot, suddenly too exhausted to stand. Because from where I'm sitting, it feels like I could save this entire ranch and half the town would still want me gone. Half the town, maybe, but not all of it. Elias pulled up the small wooden chair and sat. You know what Charlie said to me earlier? He said you've got sand. That's high praise from him. Sand. Courage. Backbone. Whatever you want to call it. He stretched his legs out. Point is, you're winning people over, slowly. It doesn't feel like it in the moment, but you are. And the ones I'm not winning over? They'll come around or they won't. Either way, you've proven you belong here. That's what matters. Mei Lin looked down at her bandaged shoulder. I don't feel like I belong anywhere. The admission surprised her. She hadn't meant to say it out loud. Elias was quiet for a long moment. You know what I learned in the war? Belonging isn't something that happens to you. It's something you build. Every day you show up, every time you do the hard thing, you're building it, brick by brick. That sounds exhausting. It is. He stood. But the alternative is worse. After he left, Mei Lin lay on her cot and listened to the last remnants of the storm moving away. Thunder rumbled in the distance, growing fainter with each passing minute. Her shoulder hurt, her whole body hurt. But underneath the pain was something else, something that felt almost like pride. She'd run toward danger instead of away from it. She'd saved the horses. She'd stood in the rain and fought a fire alongside men who'd barely tolerated her existence a month ago. Maybe that counted for something. Morning came too early, bringing with it a landscape transformed by the storm. The storage shed was a blackened ruin. Trees were down across the property. Debris was scattered everywhere, and a section of the main fence had been completely flattened. The work of rebuilding started immediately. Mei Lin, restricted to one-arm tasks, found herself doing inventory and organizing supplies. It was tedious work but necessary, and it gave her a chance to see how the ranch operated from a different angle. Mrs. Mackenzie, who insisted Mei Lin call her Margaret, brought her lunch around noon. How's the shoulder? Sore, but functional. Good. Margaret set down a plate of bread and cold meat. I wanted to thank you properly. Those horses are part of the family. Losing them would have broken my husband's heart. Anyone would have done the same. But they didn't. You did. Margaret settled into the chair Elias had occupied the night before. Can I ask you something personal? Mei Lin tensed. Personal questions rarely led anywhere good. I suppose? Why stay? After everything this town has put you through, why not move on? It was the same question Mei Lin had asked herself 100 times. The answer should have been simple, but when she tried to put it into words, it twisted into something more complicated. Because I'm tired of running, she said finally. I've been running since my mother died. Different towns, different jobs, always one step ahead of whatever was chasing me, and it never got better. It just got lonelier. She paused, trying to articulate something she'd only recently begun to understand. Here, at least the fight is for something. I have a job, I have a room, I have... She stopped, unsure how to finish. People who care whether you live or die? Margaret offered gently. Maybe. I'm still getting used to that part. Margaret reached over and squeezed Mei Lin's good hand. You're braver than you think, and I'm glad you stayed. The words settled into Mei Lin's chest like a warm stone. Over the next few days, as the ranch slowly returned to normal, something fundamental shifted in how people treated her. Not dramatically. No grand gestures or public declarations, but Peter stopped making snide comments. Dutch actually spoke to her, just a gruff morning when they passed, but still. The other ranch hands included her in their evening card games without her having to ask. Small things, but they added up. A week after the storm, Elias found her in the barn, trying to brush down Maple one-handed. You're going to hurt yourself doing that, he observed. Probably. She switched the brush to her other hand, gritting her teeth against the pain in her shoulder. But Maple's getting impatient with me. The mare snorted as if in agreement. Elias took the brush from her. Let me. I can do it. I know you can. I'm offering anyway. He started working on Maple's coat with smooth, practiced strokes. You're going to have to let people help you sometimes. That's not weakness. Feels like it. Well, it's not. He moved to Maple's other side. You know what is weakness? Being too proud to accept help when you need it. That's just stupidity wearing a fancy hat. Despite herself, Mei Lin smiled. You have a way with words. I'm a poet. Didn't you know? He grinned, and for a moment he looked younger, less weighed down by whatever ghosts he carried. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds Maple's contented breathing and the swish of the brush. Can I ask you something? Mei Lin said eventually. Sure. Why me? Specifically. There must be dozens of people who need help. Why spend so much time on one stubborn Chinese woman who can't even accept a brush without arguing? Elias's hand stilled. He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. You remember I told you about my sister? He finally said. The flood. Yes. What I didn't tell you was that she looked at the world like you do, like she was constantly bracing for the next hit but refused to back down anyway. He resumed brushing, his movements almost automatic. She had this way of standing, chin up, shoulders back, even when she was terrified, especially when she was terrified. He paused, his jaw working. After she died, I saw that same look on other people sometimes. People who'd been kicked down so many times they expected it, but they kept getting back up anyway. He looked at Mei Lin directly. You had that look when you first showed up in Red Hollow, like you expected the worst, but you'd be damned if you'd make it easy for them. And that reminded you of her. Yeah. He set down the brush. Made me think, if I couldn't save her, maybe I could help someone else who had that same fight in them. Someone who deserved a fair chance. Mei Lin didn't know what to say to that. The weight of it was too much. Being someone's second chance at redemption, carrying the ghost of a dead girl she'd never met. That's a lot to put on someone, she said quietly. I know. And it's not fair. Elias picked up the brush again, focusing intently on a particularly tangled section of Maple's mane. But I'm not asking you to be her. I'm just saying you reminded me that there are people worth fighting for, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. What if I don't want to be fought for? What if I just want to fight my own battles? Then I'll stand next to you while you do it. He said it simply, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. That's what friends do. Friends. The word hung in the air between them, strange and new and terrifying in its implications. Mei Lin had forgotten what friendship felt like, the weight and warmth of it, the way it required trust, which meant vulnerability, which meant potential hurt. Is that what we are? She asked. Friends? Elias considered this. I'd like to think so. Unless you've got a better word for two people who keep pulling each other out of trouble. Co-conspirators? That works too. He finished with Maple and hung up the brush. Either way, you're stuck with me. Lucky me, Mei Lin said, but there was no bite to it. That night, lying in her patched-up room with her shoulder still aching and the memory of smoke still sharp in her nose, Mei Lin thought about friendship and belonging and all the small ways a person could build a life from nothing. She thought about Elias's words. Belonging is something you build, brick by brick. She thought about Margaret's gratitude and Charlie's grudging respect and even Peters's newfound silence. She thought about running toward the fire instead of away from it, and for the first time since her mother died, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she was building something worth keeping. The thought terrified her, because things built could be destroyed. Homes could burn. People could leave or die or decide you weren't worth the trouble after all. But they could also stand. They could weather storms and fires and all the violence that life threw at them. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that had to be enough. Outside, an owl called in the darkness. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed softly. The ranch settled into its nighttime rhythms, alive and breathing around her. Mei Lin closed her eyes and let herself be part of it. The second fire came 6 weeks later, and this time it wasn't an accident. Mei Lin woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of horses screaming. For one disoriented moment, she thought she was back in the storm, reliving that terrible night. Then her brain caught up, and she realized this was different, worse. She bolted from her cot, not bothering with boots, and threw open the door. The main barn was engulfed in flames. Not the small storage shed this time, the barn where they kept the horses, the tack, most of the ranch's valuable equipment, and the fire was already too big, too hot, spreading too fast to be anything but deliberate. Someone had set this. "Fire!" she screamed, her voice raw. "Everyone up! Fire!" The bunkhouse door slammed open and ranch hands poured out, some still pulling on shirts, all of them moving toward the barn. "The horses!" Charlie shouted. "We need to get them out!" But the heat was too intense. Flames were already licking out the windows, and black smoke billowed from every opening. Getting inside would be suicide. Elias appeared beside Mei Lin, his face grim. How many horses were in there? 4, Thunder, Bess, and 2 of the new geldings. Her throat closed up. "We can't just let them. We can't get to them." His voice was flat, final. "Not without dying ourselves." The screaming from inside the barn cut off suddenly, one by one, until there was just the roar of the fire and the crackle of burning wood. Mei Lin felt something break inside her chest. They fought the fire anyway, more to save the surrounding buildings than any hope of salvaging the barn itself. By the time the sun rose, the structure was a smoking skeleton, and 4 horses were dead. Mackenzie walked through the ruins, his face carved from stone. When he found the oil-soaked rags near what used to be the back door, he didn't look surprised. "Arson," he said simply. "Someone wanted to hurt us." "The Morrison brothers," Elias said immediately. "Has to be. Maybe. Or maybe someone else with a grudge." Mackenzie kicked at a charred beam. "Doesn't matter who. What matters is we just lost 4 good horses and most of our equipment. That's going to cost—" He stopped, calculating. "More than we can afford right now." The silence that followed was heavy. "We'll rebuild," Margaret said firmly, appearing from the main house with coffee and determination. "We've survived worse, have we?" Mackenzie's voice was tired in a way Mei Lin had never heard before. "I'm getting too old for this, Maggie. Every time we get ahead, something knocks us back down. Then we get up again. That's what we do." But the damage went deeper than lost livestock and equipment. Over the next few days, Mei Lin watched the ranch hands grow paranoid, jumping at shadows, arguing over who should keep watch and when. Trust eroded as people started wondering if the arsonist was one of them. Peters especially seemed to fixate on Mei Lin. "Convenient," he said loudly during dinner 3 days after the fire. "Nothing bad happens until she shows up, then we get fires and trouble." "Shut your mouth," Raphael said sharply. "Why? We all thinking it." Peters looked around the table. "She's the only thing that's changed around here. Maybe someone's got a problem with the ranch for hiring her. Or maybe," Charlie said slowly, "someone's got a problem with her and is trying to hurt the ranch to get at her. Ever think of that?" Peters faltered, clearly not having considered that angle. Mei Lin set down her fork carefully. "If me being here is putting everyone in danger, I'll leave." "No," Elias said immediately. "Elias." "No," he repeated, harder this time. "That's exactly what they want. Someone burns our barn and you run away. They win twice. They hurt us, and they get rid of you. But if staying puts everyone at risk, then we deal with the risk, Mackenzie cut in. I don't negotiate with cowards who set fires in the night. You're staying, and that's final. It should have felt like support. Instead, it felt like being a weight around everyone's neck. That night, Maylin couldn't sleep. She lay on her cot, staring at the ceiling, listening to every sound outside and wondering if each one was someone coming to finish what they'd started. Around midnight, she heard footsteps approaching her door. Her hand went to the knife under her pillow. She'd started sleeping with it again after the barn burned. But it was just Elias, holding a rifle and looking like he hadn't slept either. Can't stop thinking about those horses, he said without preamble. Me neither. Bess was old. She deserved better than burning alive. He leaned against the doorframe. Thunder was barely 3, had his whole life ahead of him. They sat with that for a moment. I'm going into town tomorrow, Elias said finally. Going to ask some questions, see if anyone knows anything about who might have set that fire. That's dangerous. So is doing nothing. He met her eyes. You want to come with me? Every instinct screamed at her to stay hidden, stay safe. But safe hadn't protected the horses. Safe hadn't prevented the fire. Yes, she said. They rode into Red Hollow just after dawn, both armed, both wearing expressions that discouraged conversation. The town was just waking up, shopkeepers opening their doors, early risers heading to the bakery, the usual rhythms of a small settlement pretending to be civilized. Elias tied his horse outside the saloon and pushed through the doors. Maylin followed. The place was nearly empty this early, just the bartender wiping down glasses and one old-timer nursing what was probably his first drink of many. Need information, Elias said without bothering with pleasantries. About who might have set fire to Mackenzie's barn. The bartender, a heavy-set man named Bill, who'd always treated Maylin with careful neutrality, set down his rag. That's a serious accusation to be throwing around, Boone. It's a serious crime. 4 horses died. Heard about that. Shame. Bill picked up another glass, started polishing. But I don't know anything about it. Didn't ask if you knew. Asked if you'd heard anything. Rumors, drunk talk, someone bragging about teaching the ranch a lesson. Bill's hands stilled. You know I don't repeat what I hear in here. Bad for business. Bill, Elias's voice dropped low. Those horses suffered. Whoever did this, they're going to do it again unless someone stops them. The old-timer at the bar spoke up suddenly. Morrison boy's been drinking heavy the past few nights. Heard Dale saying something about teaching outsiders a lesson. Didn't think much of it at the time. Ed, Bill said warningly. What? I'm old. I can say what I want. Ed took a sip of his drink. Besides, if they're burning down barns, they've crossed a line. That's not just harassment. That's property destruction. Elias turned to Maylin. Wait here. Not a chance. Maylin, we're past the point where you can protect me from everything. I'm coming. They found Frank and Dale Morrison at their family's spread about 2 miles outside town. The brothers were in the yard working on a wagon that had seen better days. Frank saw them coming and straightened slowly. Well, well, the cowboy and his pet China girl. Need to ask you some questions, Elias said, dismounting. Don't have to answer anything. No, but you're going to anyway. Elias crossed his arms. Where were you 6 nights ago? That's none of your... Where were you? Dale shifted nervously, but Frank held his ground. Home. Sleeping. Why? Someone burned down Mackenzie's barn, killed 4 horses. Frank's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. That's a shame. But what's it got to do with us? You tell me. You've been shooting your mouth off about teaching outsiders lessons, about how the ranch shouldn't have hired... Elias jerked his head toward Maylin. Someone who doesn't belong. Lots of people think that. Doesn't mean we set any fires. Then you won't mind if I take a look around. Elias started toward their barn. You got no right. Frank moved to block him. What happened next happened fast. Frank grabbed Elias's shoulder. Elias spun, caught Frank's wrist, twisted it back. Dale rushed forward. Maylin moved without thinking, grabbing a piece of firewood from the pile near the house and swinging it at Dale's legs. He went down hard, cursing. Elias had Frank pressed against the wagon, one arm behind his back. I'm going to ask you one more time. Did you burn that barn? Go to hell. Wrong answer. Elias applied more pressure. Frank gasped. We didn't do it, Dale shouted from the ground. I swear we talked about it, yeah, but we didn't actually. Shut up, Frank snarled. Who did? Mei Lin asked, still holding the firewood like a weapon. If it wasn't you, who was it? Dale hesitated, then the words tumbled out. Carl Henderson. He was going on about how the ranch was taking business from his brother's store, how having that Chinese woman working there was an insult, said someone needed to send a message. You're lying, Frank spat. No, he's not, Elias said quietly, reading the truth in Dale's face. He's scared, and scared men tell the truth. He released Frank with a shove. Stay here. Don't even think about running. They found Carl Henderson at his brother's store, restocking shelves like he hadn't committed arson less than a week ago. Elias didn't say a word. He just walked up, grabbed Carl by the collar, and dragged him outside into the street. What the hell? Carl struggled, but Elias had size and rage on his side. A crowd was gathering, people drawn by the commotion, emerging from shops and houses to watch. This man, Elias announced, his voice carrying, burned down Mackenzie's barn, killed 4 horses. And why? Because he can't handle competition. Because he's so small and petty that he'd rather destroy than adapt. That's a lie. Carl's face was red. I never. Dale Morrison says different. Says you were bragging about sending a message. Elias shoved Carl toward the sheriff's office. Time to answer for what you did. The sheriff, an older man named Warren who generally tried to stay out of conflicts, emerged from his office looking deeply unhappy. What's this about, Boone? Arson, murder of livestock, property destruction. Elias didn't let go of Carl. Multiple witnesses placing Carl Henderson at the scene and hearing him make threats. That's... Sheriff Warren sighed. Carl, is this true? No, they're lying! But his voice cracked on the denial, and everyone heard it. The sheriff looked at the crowd, at Elias, at Mei Lin standing there with dirt on her clothes and fire in her eyes. He seemed to age 10 years in as many seconds. Bring him inside, he said wearily. We'll sort this out proper. The trial, if you could call it that, happened 3 days later. Red Hollow didn't have a formal courthouse, so they used the town hall. Half the settlement showed up to watch. Carl Henderson maintained his innocence right up until the moment Dale Morrison took the stand, such as it was, and testified that Carl had asked him and Frank to help with a job the night of the fire. The Morrison brothers had refused, not out of morality, but out of self-preservation. But Carl had gone ahead anyway. When confronted with the oil-soaked rags that matched those found in Carl's own storage shed, he finally broke. She had no right, he shouted, pointing at Mei Lin. Coming here, taking jobs, making us look bad for not wanting her kind around. Someone had to do something. The silence in the hall was absolute. Sheriff Warren stood slowly. Carl Henderson, you're hereby charged with arson and destruction of property. You'll be transported to Abilene for proper sentencing. Until then, you're in my custody. As they led Carl away, still shouting about protecting the town from outsiders, Patricia Caldwell, who'd been sitting in the front row, stood up. He's not wrong, she said, her voice shaking slightly but determined. Maybe he went about it the wrong way, but his concerns are valid. This town is changing, and not for the better. Margaret Mackenzie stood up in response. My husband has run Lone Cedar Ranch for 20 years. In that time, we've hired men of every background you can imagine. Mexicans, freed slaves, Irish immigrants, men running from pasts they'd rather forget. You want to know what mattered? Whether they worked hard and treated others decent. She looked directly at Patricia. Mei Lin saved our horses during the storm, risked her own life to do it. That's worth more than your narrow definition of who belongs here. One good deed doesn't... It's not one deed. The voice came from the back. Charlie, standing with several other ranch hands. She's been pulling her weight for 2 months now. Does the work without complaining. Doesn't cause trouble. What more do you people want? More voices joined in. Raphael talking about how Mei Lin had helped him fix a broken fence in record time. One of the townswomen, someone Mei Lin had never even spoken to, mentioning that Mrs. Chen's laundry business had saved her family money. Not everyone spoke up. Plenty of people sat in stony silence, their minds unchanged. But enough voices rose in defense that the balance shifted just slightly. Patricia Caldwell sat down, her face flushed. After the meeting dispersed, Maylin stood outside the town hall feeling unmoored. People had defended her, publicly. Risked social standing to say she deserved to be here. "You okay?" Elias asked, appearing at her elbow. "I don't know." She pressed a hand to her chest where something felt too big and too fragile all at once. "People stood up for me. People recognized the truth. That's different." He started walking toward where they'd tied the horses. "Though I'll admit, I didn't expect Charlie to say anything. He's usually about as talkative as a fence post. Maybe people surprise you." "Maybe." He helped her mount Maple, then swung onto his own horse. "Carl's going to prison. That should send a message that burning property won't be tolerated." "But it won't change how people feel. You heard Patricia. She thinks he's right." "Some people you can't reach. They're too invested in being angry." Elias guided his horse toward the road out of town. But the fact that others spoke up, that matters. It means the tide's turning, even if it's just a little. They rode in silence for a while, the afternoon sun warm on their backs. "Can I tell you something?" Maylin said eventually. "Always. I think I'm starting to believe I might actually have a future here. Not just surviving day to day, but actually building something." She paused. "That terrifies me." "Good." "Good?" "Means you care. Means you've got something to lose." He glanced at her. "That's scary, yeah. But it's also what makes life worth living." Back at the ranch, Mackenzie had news. Insurance came through for the barn. Not as much as I hoped, but enough to rebuild. "We start next week." The rebuilding became a community effort. Ranch hands from neighboring spreads showed up to help. Some because they owed Mackenzie favors, others because word had spread about what happened and they wanted to show support. Even a few townspeople came. Not many. Mrs. Chen, the baker who'd always been kind, a handful of others. But they came. Maylin worked alongside everyone else, hauling lumber, holding boards while others hammered, learning the basics of construction through trial and error and patience from people who'd built dozens of barns over their lifetimes. Raphael taught her how to properly set a post. Charlie showed her how to read a level. Even Peters, grudgingly, gruffly, demonstrated the right way to hammer a nail so it didn't split the wood. It took 3 weeks to finish. The new barn wasn't as large as the old one, but it was solid, well-built, and represented something more than just shelter for animals. It represented refusal to be broken. The night they completed it, Mackenzie threw an impromptu celebration. Nothing fancy, just food and music, and people tired from honest work sharing space with others who understood what it meant to build something from ashes. Maylin found herself sitting on a hay bale, watching Raphael play a battered guitar, while others clapped along. Margaret pressed a plate of food into her hands. Charlie nodded at her from across the yard. Even Dutch smiled, which Maylin had previously thought was physically impossible. "Quite a change from when you first showed up," Mrs. Chen observed, settling beside her with a satisfied sigh. "That feels like a lifetime ago." "Only 4 months, but I suppose a lot can happen in 4 months." Mrs. Chen sipped from her cup. "You planning to stay? Is that still a question?" "Always a question. Life is long, child. People change their minds." Maylin thought about that. "I don't know what the future holds, but I know I'm tired of running from it." "Good answer." Mrs. Chen patted her knee. "Very good answer." Later, as the celebration wound down and people started heading home, Elias found Maylin standing near the new barn, running her hand along the wood. "Thinking deep thoughts?" "Just taking it in." She turned to face him. "Thank you. For everything. For the canteen, for teaching me to ride, for standing up when everyone else was content to stand by." "You already thanked me. Multiple times." "I know. But I needed to say it again." She took a breath. "You asked me once why I was so determined to survive. I didn't have a good answer then. But I think I do now." "Yeah?" "Because giving up would mean all the people who tried to break me were right. That I didn't deserve to exist in spaces they controlled." Her voice strengthened. "And I refused to give them that satisfaction." Elias smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "That's the spirit." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the last of the guests depart, watching the ranch settle into its nighttime rhythms. "Your sister would have liked this," Maylin said quietly. "The barn raising, the community coming together." "Yeah, she would have." Elias's expression was bittersweet. She always believed people were better than they showed themselves to be. Just needed the right circumstances to prove it. Was she right? Some people, yeah. Others, he shrugged. Others are exactly as bad as they seem. But I think she'd say that even one person proving themselves better makes the whole thing worthwhile. Optimistic. She was 14 when she died. Still had time to be optimistic. He turned to Mei Lin. But you know what? After everything we've been through, I'm starting to think she wasn't entirely wrong. The months that followed weren't easy. Prejudice didn't evaporate just because Carl Henderson went to prison. People still crossed the street to avoid Mei Lin. Store clerks still treated her with suspicion. The Morrison brothers made themselves scarce, but their resentment hung in the air like smoke. But there were shifts, small and significant. The baker started greeting Mei Lin by name. A few ranch wives asked Mrs. Chen to teach them some Chinese cooking techniques. The new school teacher, young and idealistic, made a point of being friendly. It wasn't acceptance, not fully, but it was acknowledgement that she existed as more than just an outsider to be removed. Mei Lin learned to take her victories where she found them. She got better at ranch work, her body adapting to the physical demands, her skills sharpening with practice. Mackenzie raised her pay after 6 months, saying she'd earned it. Charlie started asking her opinion on things, treating her like an equal rather than a temporary fixture. And Elias remained a constant presence, not hovering, not smothering, just there when she needed someone to talk to or someone to share silence with. One evening, nearly a year after she'd first arrived in Red Hollow, Mei Lin sat outside her small room and watched the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors. Mrs. Chen found her there, lowered herself onto the ground with a grunt. "You look contemplative," the older woman observed, "just thinking about how different everything is now." Different good or different bad? Different, real. Mei Lin struggled to articulate it. For so long, I was just trying to survive. Every day was about making it to the next one. But now I'm actually living, making plans, thinking about next month, next year. That's called having a future, child. I know, it's still strange. Mrs. Chen was quiet for a moment. You know what the hardest part of surviving is? It's allowing yourself to do more than just survive. It's choosing to be happy when you've spent so long expecting misery. Is that what I'm doing? I hope so. Mrs. Chen's voice was gentle. You deserve happiness, Mei Lin. Not just survival, not just getting by. Real, messy, complicated happiness. After Mrs. Chen left, Mei Lin sat with those words, turning them over like stones in a river. Happiness had always felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. Something for other people, people whose lives hadn't been torn apart by disease and violence and casual cruelty. But maybe that was the wrong way to think about it. Maybe happiness wasn't something you earned through suffering. Maybe it was something you built, same as everything else, brick by brick. The next morning, Elias found her mucking out stalls. Unglamorous work, but necessary. Got something for you, he said, holding out a small wrapped package. What is it? Open it and see. Inside was a leather journal, new and unused, and a pencil. I noticed you never talk about your family, Elias explained. About your mother or your father and brother. And I thought maybe you'd want to write it down so their stories don't get lost. Mei Lin stared at the journal, her throat tight. I don't know if I can. You don't have to, but if you want to, the option's there. He shifted his weight. My sister used to keep a journal. After she died, reading it was the only way I could still hear her voice. Felt like she was still here, in a way. What happened to it? Lost it crossing a river during the war. Still one of my biggest regrets. He touched the journal gently. So I thought, if you had stories worth keeping, might as well keep them properly. After he left, Mei Lin opened the journal to the first blank page. The emptiness felt overwhelming, but she picked up the pencil anyway. Started with her mother's name, then her father's, her brother's. And slowly, painfully, she began writing their stories. Not the sad parts, though those were there too, but the good parts. Her mother's laugh, her father's terrible jokes, her brother's gap-toothed grin. The people they were before everything fell apart. It took weeks to finish. Some days she could only manage a few sentences before the grief became too much. Other days the words poured out like water from a broken dam. When she finally wrote the last page, she felt hollowed out and strangely lighter at the same time. She showed it to Elias one evening. He read it carefully, slowly, his expression impossible to read. When he finished, he handed it back with reverent care. "They sound like good people," he said quietly. "They were. I'm sorry you lost them." "Me too." Maylin clutched the journal to her chest. "But at least now they're not just gone. They're real again, permanent." "That's the power of stories," Elias agreed. "They keep people alive long after they're gone." 2 years after arriving in Red Hollow, Mei Lin stood in the center of town during the Harvest Festival, an annual celebration that brought the whole community together. She'd been nervous about attending. Large crowds still made her uncomfortable, and she knew not everyone would be happy to see her there. But Margaret had insisted, and Mrs. Chen had bullied her into a new dress, and Charlie had offered to walk with her if she felt unsafe. So she went. The festival was loud and chaotic and full of life. Children ran between stalls selling homemade goods. Music played from a makeshift stage. The smell of roasted meat and fresh bread filled the air. And people talked to her. Not everyone. Not even most. But enough that she didn't feel invisible. The baker's wife asked about Mrs. Chen's health. A rancher from a neighboring spread complimented her work at Mackenzie's. Even Patricia Caldwell managed a stiff nod when their paths crossed. Not friendship, but acknowledgement. It wasn't perfect. It would never be perfect. But it was real. That evening, as the sun set and the festival transitioned to dancing and drinking, Mei Lin found herself sitting on the edge of the gathering with Elias, watching people celebrate. "You did it," he said. "Did what?" "Made them see you, really see you, not just as an outsider or a problem, but as a person who belongs here." Mei Lin considered that. "I don't know if I'd go that far." "I would," he gestured at the crowd. 2 years ago, half these people wanted you gone. Now you're just part of the landscape. That's not nothing. It's not everything either. No, but it's something. He stood, offered her his hand. "Come on, let's dance." "I don't know how. Neither do most of these people. They're just moving to music and pretending it's dancing." He pulled her to her feet. "You've faced down fires and floods, and people who wanted you dead. You can handle one dance." So she danced. Badly, awkwardly, stepping on Elias's feet more than once. But she danced. And somewhere in the middle of the music and the laughter and the warmth of people who'd learned to accept her presence, Mei Lin realized something fundamental had shifted. She wasn't running anymore, wasn't hiding, wasn't waiting for the next disaster to force her to move on. She was home, not because the town had become perfect or because everyone loved her, but because she'd decided this was where she belonged, and she'd fought hard enough and long enough that some people had started to believe it too. Later that night, walking back to the ranch under a sky full of stars, Elias asked the question that had been hanging between them for months. "What happens now?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, you've proven yourself. You've got a job, a place to live, people who respect you. What comes next?" Mei Lin thought about that, about the journal full of her family's stories, about the barn they'd rebuilt together, about all the small, hard-won victories that had brought her to this moment. "I keep building," she said finally. "Keep showing up. Keep proving that I deserve to be here." She looked at him. "What about you? What happens now?" Elias was quiet for a long moment. "I think, and this might sound strange, I think I'm finally done punishing myself for not saving my sister." "Elias, no, it's good. I spent years trying to make up for that one moment, trying to save everyone else as a way to redeem myself." He stopped walking, turned to face her. "But helping you these past 2 years, it wasn't about redemption. It was just doing the right thing because it needed doing. Is there a difference?" "Yeah, there is." He smiled, tired but genuine. "Redemption is about fixing yourself. Doing right is about helping someone else. I think I finally figured out which one actually matters." They walked the rest of the way in comfortable silence. At the ranch, Mei Lin paused before heading to her room. "Thank you for seeing me when everyone else was determined to look away." "Thank you for being worth seeing," Elias replied. It wasn't poetry. It wasn't dramatic. But it was true, and that was enough. Years later, when people asked Mei Lin about those early days in Red Hollow, she would tell them it wasn't a story about heroism or dramatic transformation. It was a story about showing up, day after day, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard, about building a life from nothing, one small choice at a time, about refusing to let cruelty define her worth or determine her future, about finding home not in a place that welcomed her with open arms, but in a place where she fought for every inch of acceptance and decided that fight was worth making, and about understanding that belonging isn't given, it's built, with work, with time, with people who choose to stand beside you instead of against you, with dignity that no one can take away unless you let them. The woman who'd arrived in Red Hollow covered in dirt and convinced she was worthless had become someone else. Not perfect, not unscathed, but whole in ways that mattered. And when new outsiders arrived in town, frightened, desperate, expecting the worst, Mei Lin made sure to offer them water and a kind word and the knowledge that survival was possible, that belonging was possible, that they deserved to exist in whatever space they chose to occupy. Because someone had done that for her once, and it had made all the difference. The Texas wind still cut through Red Hollow with the same indifferent cruelty it always had. But Mei Lin had learned to stand against it, and that in the end was the only victory that truly mattered.